Good day, and welcome to our Code Blue series. January is National Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and the Prince George's County Human Trafficking Task Force is releasing 5 different video conversations around the issue of human trafficking. And the conversations will be with just some of our partners, but the task force is comprised of many partners, both in the public and private sector. So today we are thrilled to have our partners, the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. They're providing the technical support. The Department of Family Justices, the Department of Family Justice, and the Department of Family Services, Domestic Violence and Human Trafficking Division, as well as the Human Relations Commission. So I will please ask for our panelists to introduce themselves, and then I'll introduce myself and explain a little bit about your agency and what it does. So let's start with Dr. McCain.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Ms. Battle Brooks, for having me and hosting this event today. As was stated, I am Denise McCain, the director of the Prince George's County Family Justice Center. We've been in existence now since 2016, and we are what we consider the one-stop shop resource, providing an array of services for survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual assault, as well as elder abuse. The Family Justice Center is a model that the Department of Justice has identified as a best practice, and that's largely because we have 21 local government and private nonprofit organizations that are all co-located in one building. So if you can imagine someone needing services rather than having to go to 3, 4, 5, 6 different places, they can get all of their needs met in the one facility at the Family Justice Center.
Well, that is wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. McCain. And Jackie Rhone, if you would please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your agency and how it relates to human trafficking and or domestic violence.
So good afternoon. Thanks for doing this, actually, Ms. Battle Brooks. I am Jackie Rhone with the Department of Family Services, the Domestic Violence and Human Trafficking Division. And we are the lead health and human service agency that works in that space of domestic violence and human trafficking. We are responsible for community outreach and education in both of those spaces. We work with all the nonprofit providers in the community, as well as we are a member at the Family Justice Center. We provide a housing resource coordinating position that supports both survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking. And we are a partner as well with the task force.
Awesome. We're thrilled to have both of your organizations as partners. And I'm Renee Battle Brooks, Executive Director of the Prince George's County Human Relations Commission. And one of our 5 pillars is chairing the Prince George's County Human Trafficking Task Force. So today we thought we would discuss just a little bit about what human trafficking is and how it relates to domestic violence and what those intersections are. So human trafficking is both labor and sex, and it requires force, fraud, or coercion for something in exchange. If it's sex trafficking, something of a sexual nature in exchange for something of value given to someone. And if it's labor, it's force, fraud, or coercion, and some sort of labor, and they're different types. And we're not going to delve too deeply. Invite us back because we will talk about that later if you want to hear. But labor in exchange for something of value. Now, there's one caveat that in sex trafficking, if you are a child, so if you're under 18, force, fraud, or coercion do not have to be proven. You just have to prove that the child is under 18, that there's some sort of sexual act given in exchange for something of value. So with that background of what human trafficking is, let's talk about domestic violence. What is domestic violence? And perhaps describe for those that are listening the circle, the cycle, what makes it up. So I throw that out. Either one of you ladies can start.
So I'll start. Domestic violence, also referred to as intimate partner violence, it's really a pattern of behavior. That's something that I think people don't oftentimes think about when you associate domestic violence or intimate partner violence as an issue. It's oftentimes perceived as an individual act perpetrated against an individual, but it's actually a pattern of behavior. And the underpinnings, it's always about power and control. One person having the power, using varying tactics, forms of abuse to manipulate the victim. And generally, it's to get the person to not necessarily do what they want them to do, somewhat like human trafficking, but more or less just to have that sense of power over the individual. And so there are many forms of domestic violence, whether it manifests itself as physical abuse, sexual violence, mental, emotional, psychological, financial. These are all tools and tactics that an abuser would use to control someone. And that's pretty much just the basic element of what domestic violence is about without going into more detail. And I don't know how much you want me to talk about it at this point, but that's just a good overview.
Okay, excellent. And Ms. Rhone, anything you would like to add?
No, the only other thing I would add is that it's important to note that along with that control behavior is for people to realize that it can affect anyone. So it's not female specific or male specific. It actually, when we talk about controlling anyone, any age group. So I would like to add that as well.
I think that's such a
and that, as you probably are going to mention, also is a true factor as we start talking about human trafficking.
Yes, and it's such a good point that you raised, because there is no profile or one type of who can be a victim of domestic violence or human trafficking. It crosses all socioeconomic, it crosses all education, it crosses all gender or how you identify, all ethnicities, religions, race. And so I think that we as human beings, to make ourselves feel safer, right? It doesn't happen to me or somebody in my sphere, right? And that's that coping mechanism that we all use, so that if we can make it something over there, then we're less vulnerable. But I think the issue that you raise is so important, because we let our guard down, then we're not going to see some of those things. So the pattern of behavior, I love the way you described that, Dr. McCain. So let's unpeel that a little bit. So the pattern of behavior as relates to human trafficking, right? We see some of those very same things, the power, the control. So I'm sure that both of you have come across those situations. If you want to talk a little bit more about that power control on the human trafficking side, and tying it back to what Dr. McCain said on the domestic violence front.
So some of those patterns or the risk factors that we see in both human trafficking and domestic violence are things like isolation. In many cases, sometimes it can be from a mental perspective, where people are saying demeaning things to you. So it starts to deal with your psyche, your mental health. I try to think of some other things, Denise, that are similar in that control.
So you're right, Jackie. Isolation is a big one. And if you add to that the restricted movement, we see that in both domestic violence, particularly now with COVID, where individuals are forced to be in the same confined quarters for extended period of time. But we know that that's also a part of the dynamics within human trafficking as well. Of course, it's the degradation, the name calling, and then even looking at withholding or controlling documents, which is particularly relevant to immigrants who need those papers. So that's another way that this tactic is used to control, and even controlling of finances. It happens in both those populations, both amongst victims of domestic violence as well as human trafficking. So I think what we know and what we see is that the dynamics that are involved in human trafficking, they are very frequently interwoven into the same aspects of what we see in domestic violence.
And the other big one I just thought about is that word love. In many cases, the abuser or they use the word love because they control you in that manner, because either they know that you love them or they
Mhm.
want you to love them. So they use that whole control factor of love, and that's a big emotional um, tool that they use to control in both relationships, whether it's love because they say no one else is going to love you, so if you leave me, or because they know that you love them. So love is a really big factor in the whole emotional power that they try to use to control their victims.
Yeah, when you say that, I'm reminded that that is sort of one of the fraud
Mm-hmm.
that is perpetrated, especially on the human trafficking side, and particularly the sex trafficking side of human trafficking. That whole, I love you, do this for me, this is for us, this is to build our future. The whole,
Or I did that because I love you.
right, that, yes,
Mhm.
yes, whether it's the beating or, or whatever. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The, I think the commonality between both, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've had more experience dealing on the human trafficking side than on the domestic violence side, but this whole, I love you the most, no one will love you like I do, this whole sort of, I say predators, right?
Mhm.
On the human trafficking side, I say definitely predators, and they know how to tap in to that place that we don't even know exists.
Mhm.
I was at a conference, and I heard a survivor talk, and she was talking to this whole thing about sort of the power and the control and the psyche, and how her trafficker of sex got in. And he was able to identify something that she, at a conscious level, she said, had not even identified as a need. But you see, predators,
Mhm.
the one thing that I've learned over my years of dealing in this space, or child abuse or sexual assault space, because they're commonalities and they overlap, is that predators are some of the smartest people you'll ever meet. Predators,
Absolutely.
predators have a gift of being able to read you, whether it's in person or online, and figure out what it is,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
so it reminded me of several cases that I dealt with, where tapping in to that reserve. So this, back to the survivor, she said she didn't even acknowledge or realize that part of what she was wanting and yearning for was love and acceptance. That wasn't anything that she even recognized herself, and that he tapped into that, put his claws in as a predator, and that's how she was sucked in for
Yeah.
years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and that's real. And I would say it's the same dynamic for survivors and victims of domestic violence. I mean, the other piece that's very common there is the self-esteem. Victims, I would say for sure, for domestic violence and probably human trafficking as well, there are issues with not having very high self-esteem. And that's what perpetrators can see. That's what they tap into. So they play on that weakness, on that vulnerability, by getting them to believe that, yes, that they love them. In fact, we talk about the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde character in domestic violence. They start out being these wonderful men, showering them with all the love and attention that they seek and desire, until they know that they have them within their grips. And that's when you start seeing the change, where the other behaviors now start to reveal themselves, and victims oftentimes don't even realize what had happened to them. They also have, in many instances, because we talk about this as learned behavior, have witnessed it growing up in their homes, And they accept it as normal. They think that this is just the way relationships are. So it is definitely something where we also know that there are certain characteristics that are typically associated with victims as well as perpetrators. But you hit it right on the head, Renee. It's something within that's missing, that they are seeking, love that they never received or want, and find themselves, unfortunately, at the hands of these perpetrators.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you said that, because there's some studies that show a couple of things. One, for our survivors, that a vast majority of them have also been victims of child abuse. And I'm talking now in the sex trafficking, not the labor sex trafficking. That I think it was Rhone that put out a statistic. It was something alarming, like it was 94, 96% of those that they had studied had been. So when you talk about the self-esteem, it's not that there's a lack of self-esteem, but there's already been some trauma that has severed sort of what we would term as, childhood not affected by trauma, but trauma from somebody that you trust, whether it's a relative or a person in authority, right? Exactly. And so ripe for the picking, really, because that's already been severed, been dealt with, been damaged. The other thing, sort of the self-esteem, other studies show that a survivor of sexual human trafficking, it takes an average of 7 times to leave. It's called the life or the game, depending on whether you're the trafficker or the survivor, right? But to leave the life 7 times on average, leave, go back before they finally leave. And so that plays a lot into sort of these dynamics that you talked about, Denise, that are sort of the control, the mental, the financial, right?
Right. And they've been led to believe that they can't do it without their perpetrators. There is no life without me. Either you're not capable or no one will want you. And then too, there's another element, particularly when we talk about, survivors of human trafficking, getting caught up in the system, which sometimes makes it very difficult for them to get jobs, to sustain themselves. Even if they wanted to leave the life, it's not an easy transition.
Yeah, and predators know all of this, and they prey on it. Let's speak just a little bit about, we talked about trauma, but the trauma bond, how that is both applicable in domestic violence and human trafficking. And we're going to show the will, the power control will. It'll be on the screen, and just everything we've talked about, you can relate it to both domestic violence and human trafficking. So let's talk a little bit in our last few minutes about trauma bond. First of all, define, what is it? And why does it work so well? Anybody want to jump in? Or I can.
You can.
Yeah.
You can.
So predators, they play on this idea of trauma, right? And the trauma bond, also known as the Stockholm syndrome, right? Something traumatic happens that bonds you to that person, good or bad, right? And so when we learned about the Stockholm syndrome in the day, right, it was a case about bank robbers in Sweden, right? And they took hostage. And by the end of, it may have been a week, and I don't remember all the details, the people that had been victimized by this kidnapping and this bondage were very, very concerned about the outcome of the perpetrators, and right. So they had bonded and they didn't want anything bad to happen. Right. But it affects the way you perceive things. It affects the way you process things. It affects the way you navigate through life. So maybe in the DV world or the domestic violence world, maybe unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, well, it's an attachment that you actually start to identify with the abuser. And what they do so skillfully is that they convince you that, you are a part of them and that you're in this together. And there is no self. The victim loses the sense of self and connects more with the perpetrator, much as in domestic violence. Abusers use tactics by such telling victims it's their fault, that, you did this, you're responsible for it, because there's no accountability on the perpetrator side. And victims buy into that, they believe it. They often threaten or tell the victim that if they leave them, they'll kill themselves. So there's that codependency piece as well. So, it goes very far. There's so many different ways to look at it, but the real key to it is that it's a matter of losing self, identifying with and bonding with or connecting with the perpetrator to the extent that their wishes in life is more important than your own. There's a loss of the sense of self in these dynamics, which makes it so effective.
Yeah. Jackie, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to add the other big element that's often used in that control is the children, if they have children in common, or if the survivor has children, they spend a lot of time in delving into that valued relationship that the survivor has with their children in that household. And survivorship is important to a survivor of their children as well as for themselves. And so when they switch that switch, often say, well, you made me do this, or you'll make me do this, and they'll harm themselves or the kids, it's a really big it draws them further into that relationship to be more bound to them.
And it's interesting you should say that, because on the human trafficking side, it's not uncommon for traffickers to have children with those that they are harming. And it is a huge means of control.
Absolutely.
Making quota, not leaving, right? When it's passed through the honeymoon phase, right? Mm-hmm. And it's real, and the survivor knows exactly what this is, what's expected. Sort of the illusions have been swept away, and now they're left with the stark reality. But now they have children, and that's another form.
Right. And think about it. For any mother, the threat of someone harming your child, by any means necessary, of course, I'm going to do what I have to do to protect my child. So certainly it makes that situation even more daunting for someone.
Definitely. And I said we'd talk about trauma sort of the last few minutes, but we do have a couple of minutes left. It would be negligent for us not to talk a little bit about grooming. What does grooming mean? And we've touched on it a little bit, but what is grooming in the DV realm and then in the human trafficking realm?
I don't know that we use the term as much in domestic violence in terms of grooming. I think of that more in terms of human trafficking, but clearly getting a person to a place where they're prepared or better positioned, if you will, to carry out the wishes of a perpetrator. And again, I see that more in terms of human trafficking than domestic violence.
Yes, and we definitely use that word in the world of child abuse, sort of the grooming, more in child sex abuse versus child physical abuse. So that, it's I think the underpinning of both is that mental manipulation, that right,
and the acceptance,
right,
the acceptance factor. So in a domestic violence relationship, the same ideal of being accepted and being a part of that family unit, whatever the unit looks like, and that means I'm controlling you to do what I need you to do or want you to do for their acceptance. So when you look at it from a human trafficking perspective in the grooming, it can be acceptance, because we see that a lot in relationships where families have discarded their children because of that lack of not maybe accepting their sexuality. So it's an easier tactic for grooming in the human trafficking capacity area to see individuals or youth that are not being accepted in their space and their family, and say, come be a part of our family. If you think about it, even to this, the same thing is done when people are drawn into gangs. That grooming is done to manipulate them to be a part of that family, because we're accepting you as you are.
That's right.
And then they wake up one day and that groomer or the
But,
abuser or the
sorry.
controlling individual has them doing something that they never thought they would do or something they don't want to do.
Yeah.
And they have outcomes that are, if they don't do it, that are not beneficial for them or very harmful to them or their family members.
But I think some of the things too that the key points, which I think about, is that it, first and foremost, identifying the person because they're generally vulnerable and they have a need. And that's really where it starts, knowing that they can get this person, they can groom them by addressing that need and doing things to gain that person's trust so that they now believe that this is someone who has their best interests at heart, that loves them, who has shown them things, and perhaps even taking care of that vulnerability and that need so that, I think that was one of the most difficult things for me to understand with human trafficking. Domestic violence, no one accepts it, but I guess because it's unlike you, Renee, I've had more background in domestic violence. I know how it happens and I see it. Human trafficking on the surface, you say to yourself, how and why would someone allow them to put them out on the street and sell their bodies or force them into doing things? That just doesn't make sense, But when you really understand the front part of that, how they got there, the whole grooming element,
Yeah.
anyone could become a victim of trafficking when you really put it into that context.
Yes, and you're right. I have encountered in cases smart, well together people, educated. And so I think that point is so important for anybody watching to understand. Just as when we started, Jackie said, a survivor can be anyone.
Yeah.
Anyone. And the shame. And so again, all of these dynamics that we've talked about in the past few moments, the predator and how cunning and skillful the predator is. And the predator, mind you, it's not always a man.
That's true.
Right?
That's true.
And so we have to remember that the predator doesn't look like who we think. So all of these things are moving. If we can remember that it's power control, and in the human trafficking realm, it's also greed.
Yes.
Right? Greed with this power and control. Anything is possible. We are all vulnerable. Because remember, it doesn't just hit you in the face, usually.
Right.
There are in the trafficking realm, there are the guerrilla pimps or traffickers that, yes, that's immediate, and so that violence is what is there. But the vast majority that we run across in Prince George's County, that's just it's not saying that that's all we have. That's just saying what we run across. Don't lose that distinction. Are sort of the Romeo pimps, the one that are the predators that sweet talk and they get in there and they move around. And before that slope, you don't even know. It's sort of like that ship that is not tethered to the dock, right? And so if you're not tethered for whatever reason, prior trauma, in relationship that isn't working, financial needs, whatever those things are that the predator is going to use, if you're not tethered to something, you're not even aware that the boat is drifting. And that's how skillful that predator is, drifting, until you are in a place where either when you finally realize you're in so far you can't get out, or the people that could have helped you, that isolation has worked so that they're no longer there, or now with the embarrassment, or deeper than that, right? That you think you can get yourself out of this, you can extricate yourself from this, right? But the predator, the power, the control, it is a campaign like any war is fought. It's a campaign.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So any final words, thoughts, anything that you want to leave those that are viewing with as anything, whether it's only domestic violence, human trafficking, any thoughts?
Well, I'll just leave with something that we stated in the beginning. And I think it is key that, this is a real issue. I think that we have to do more with regard to helping the public in general understand the scale of this problem And just as, we've said, it's hiding in plain sight, that it's happening more frequently than people realize. And we have to become more proactive. We have to do more to educate ourselves, the community at large, to help really eradicate trafficking. Because I think this, and I've said this before, human trafficking is the new domestic violence. Years ago, people didn't talk about it. There were no laws, there were no resources. It was just something that happened behind closed doors. That's really where human trafficking is now. But we have to do more. We have to advocate for funds, for resources, because that's something else we didn't even talk about. The resources are just not there for survivors of human trafficking, not really domestic violence either, but I think we're a little further down the road. So I would say we have to do more. We have to talk about this, lobby, advocate, just to make sure that this issue doesn't stay hidden.
Yes, that's so excellent.
I'd say, I guess, to watch the rest of the series to get more information for sure, so that individuals can get more information, educate themselves on what domestic violence as well as human trafficking look like, so that if they're in the community, they can see something. We always say, see something, say something, so that you don't get the ideal that trafficking looks like the movies you've seen on TV, because it doesn't always look that way. And to just be it, so that you can be, if you get the information, it can be prevalent in your space, so that when you're out and about, you can start to look at things just slightly differently. And if you see something, make that phone call to 311 or 911 if you think that it's elevated to an emergency space, and so that information, so that the authorities can be alerted and go and rescue those individuals. It's just an awful space to be in, whether you're being trafficked or in a domestic violence relationship. And we just deserve better as human beings, to be in a safe, loving, truly loving environment. And there are resources between the Family Justice Center, the Department of Family Services, and there's a plethora of nonprofits in our community that can certainly offer their support when you're ready, of course. And so I would just encourage people to watch the rest of the series and to reach out to the different resources for more information, or to support, and always support. If someone comes to you, support that individual and trust that what they're saying to be true, no matter how many times they come to you. And trust them, and believe in them, and always be that listening ear.
Thank you. That's also very, very important. So to wrap up, we would say, please, if you see something, say something. That's one. If you think there's an issue, call 911. Don't think that you have to delve and get more information. If there's something that's happening in real time, call 911. You can always call 311. 311 is a non-emergency, but their hours aren't 24 hours. I think it's until 7 p.m. I'm not sure. But you can always call, or you can always send an email to us at the HRC as the task force chair, and we will make sure that it gets disseminated. So if you have any questions, or you would like some of the partners to come out to give more training through the task force, through HRC, it's free. Again, we are trying to get the word out. So our email on the screen, it's hrcstaff@co.pg.md.us. So that's hrcstaff@co.pg.md.us. So if you see something, say something, and we are going to have that power wheel up as well, so that you can see. So if you know anybody, or you suspect that somebody's being victimized, or you yourself are, there's hope. Thank you so much, ladies, and thank everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, Renee.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.